and speak with you about Ayurveda. And I talk Ayurveda day, night, in my sleep, everywhere I go. You know, there's a story, if you did your childhood in India, there's a story of Gopal, who was baby Krishna. And he doesn't study the way he should. So the teacher asks him questions, and everything is about the cow. So if you ask him a question about anything, it always comes back to the cow. And all the answers. You can ask him any question, but he'll find a way to work the cow. And do you guys remember this story? Oh, you don't know this fable. Well, I won't tell the fable now. But the point is that anything you ask me, I always bring it back to Ayurveda. So people tell me I have a one-track mind. And I kind of do. I kind of look for Ayurveda in everything. And I see things through my exposure and my understanding of Ayurveda. And I do it as a way of understanding the world around us. So I want to share some of that with you. So I had a chance to share this a little bit with GOPIO last year in November when we had the Health Summit, which I think several of you attended. And during that time, we had a panel where I certainly knew that I wouldn't get through a lot of information. So I think I gave more of a sense of just the flavor of Ayurveda. So today I want to give you more of that flavor, but I want to go through some of the specific, what shall we call, elements so that you can understand Ayurveda. And I think that's what several of you wanted to understand. So I will go through that. I think what I may have to do is switch over to that side, because if I keep reaching over, it's not going to work. So I'm going to come over to this side. I'll sit here. So what I aim to do is get through just a few of the slides. And the rest of the slides are here for if you have questions or if you have particular detailed things that you want to ask me. Okay? There's 110 slides here, so I'm not going to try to get through them. However, some of you will say, I want these slides. So if you go to my website, which is on the last slide, but it is Dr. Bhaswati, drbhaswati.com. So it's www.drbhaswati.com. And if I could have an extra of those yellow sheets, is that possible? If you can get another one, I'll refer to where. Yeah, I think somewhere on. Okay, so it's www.drbhaswati.com.
It's on the flyer. Our website.
There we go. Okay, it's on the flyer. So if you go into there, you should see a copy of the slides. Alternatively, if you want to learn more about Ayurveda, I'm not really here to plug the school, you know, and sell the school, but I do have a school of Ayurveda that meets once a month, and that's called the Dinacharya Institute. So if you go to the Dinacharya Institute's website, which is dinacharya.org, you'll find these slides there on the tab under Fundamentals, the Fundamentals course. So you can get all these slides. So there's no need to, rush to write down all of the things that I say here. So this slide is actually for all the Pitta people in the room. How many people understand what that means? Okay, so we're going to start from the beginning, because only a couple of you know what that means. Pitta people are the very goal-oriented, very particular, want as much information as possible, very curious to learn. I want to know more, I want to know more. And those people sat here and read this entire slide because they find it exciting that all of this information is being presented. How many of you read this entire slide? Yeah, so these are the Pittas in the room, right? The rest of you chilled out and said, I don't need to read this now. Why is her title slide so busy? The Pittas love this kind of busy title slide because it tells them things. So, I'm going to take you through some, well, I guess I should just say, I have a bunch of credentials. The main reason I have those credentials, and I'm sorry it says Southampton, it should have actually been, I changed it and somehow it didn't revert to say Stamford. The reason I have a lot of these credentials, I'm very, very clear, is that every time I look in the mirror, I'm a woman and I'm brown. And I went to a bunch of Ivy League schools where people were not brown and they were not women. And I faced a lot of discrimination to where I couldn't get my foot in the door in a lot of places. So I just figured if I just have the really best credentials I can, at some point they won't be able to keep the door from, from me. And I just will get over that at some point. So these credentials are basically so that people will take not only what I look like seriously, but because what I teach, for whatever reason, oh, there's an echo now. Yeah. Because what I teach is very non-mainstream. I didn't intend to be non-mainstream. I had a really nice career path along the mainstream. I would have been, you know, very, very well rewarded by society if I had chosen that path. But I really believe that if we're to be happy, we have to go to where our heart sings. My heart did not sing writing prescriptions for patients who were sick, and I knew that the drugs would make them sicker or give them side effects that would make them sicker. And when I knew they didn't need a surgery, I didn't want to prescribe those surgeries just because it's a standard of care or because of legal malpractice issues. If I don't prescribe it or if I don't recommend it, that I could risk a lawsuit. I didn't want to practice that way. And so my bank balance was getting larger and my heart was getting more heavy and I wasn't sleeping well at night. And what I realized is that what I love doing is Ayurveda, because it is a science that looks at the entire body as a member of the environment. And that environment can be your family, it can be your home, it can be the city you live in or the country that you live in, it can be on any level, but it's that ecology, it's that ecosystem that you live in that you have to be in balance with. And that means emotionally, it means mentally, it means physically, it means psychically. You have to find that balance. And there's something about that balance that is very complex and very difficult, but just felt right. So I foraged into learning that. And I'm going to not spend time on my how I got there. I can talk about it and chat about it later with you. But what I did find is that people had these questions that no one was answering. And I kind of I was disappointed that there were doctors out there who have learned Ayurveda who aren't making it a practice to figure out ways to relate it to people in a very easy way to understand. And I was very disappointed that there was a lot of secrecy around Ayurveda. And I was also very disappointed that all these doctors from India who have parents that were Ayurvedic doctors poo-poo and really are quite condescending toward Ayurveda. So I went about learning more about Ayurveda from that perspective. And really, honestly, I went about it because I was very selfish. I wanted to find cures for my patients. Because I had been told that certain things were impossible to cure. They were terminal diseases, they were chronic diseases, they were impossible to treat, they were permanent diseases. And I'm sure all of you know people or yourselves have chronic diseases. Something like 80% of our diseases today are caused by lifestyle and they are chronic diseases. We're not dying of those measles and tuberculosis and the plague and those kind of infectious diseases the way people were hundreds of years ago. Or even 100 years ago when water and sanitation and infectious disease were big concerns. We're dying of things like what? Heart disease, diabetes and complications of that, cancers, and then many of the cancers are preventable cancers. And I was seeing this again and again from medical school onwards. My training as a pharmacologist and neuroscientist had taken me into the neurologic diseases. So I'd seen a lot of chronic neurologic disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's was just becoming a big deal back in the 80s and 90s. AIDS was, at that time, a terminal disease and then later on became a chronic disease. And I went to India and I found that tucked away in these small corners, these Ayurvedic doctors, there's about 650,000 of them in India, but in a country of over 1 billion people, 650,000 is a small number. And they would do their art, and people that found them would, and not all of those 650,000 are great doctors, obviously, right? Some of them are also just as incompetent as the MDs in this country that are incompetent, and there are brilliant ones in the Ayurvedic field just as there are brilliant allopathic mainstream doctors all over the world. But those doctors that were brilliant were busy seeing patients and didn't really want to market themselves. And the ones that were not so brilliant were busy marketing themselves and trying to sell their products and things. And I wondered why they weren't out there helping you all to gain the information that they had. And it's a complex answer, but we're going to go into some of that, because I think it's important you understand why it is that you have not been exposed to more Ayurveda until now, especially because many of you have some sort of Indian or Indian origin connection. So there are 6 philosophies that contribute to Ayurveda, and if you go into the Sanskrit texts, there are many, many philosophies. Hinduism is not a religion, it's a worldview. People have made it a religion because it's something that's very different than Christianity or Judaism. But it's actually not a religion. It's just a worldview that believes that we should be in tune with our environment and respect people from a place of goodness. It has a set of values about how to behave with ourselves and with society. And because these people were near the Indus River, and Westerners that came heard Indus and they heard Hindus, they went from Indus to Hindu. The people were Hindus, and that's where the term Hindu came from. And then those people that practiced that kind of worldview were called Hindus. And one of the languages is called Hindi. So that's where that word comes from. If you go back to the Sanskrit text, there are many, many sciences. One of them is yoga. I don't think there's a person in this room today that does not know what yoga is, right? Is there anyone that hasn't heard of yoga? Okay. If you looked around this room 50 years ago, there were a lot of people that hadn't heard of yoga. But now it's quite popular. And in fact, it's a very cool thing for a guy to have a yoga mat. You know, in Manhattan, guys wear yoga mats on their back. And I asked one of my students, do you do yoga? He goes, well, it's a chick magnet. So he wears a yoga mat on his back because like really nice girls will come up to him and say, oh, would you go to yoga with me sometime? So yoga is a philosophy that's more than just these poses. It is a philosophy of thinking, and it involves thinking in a way that is in balance with our inner bodies, our inner minds, our inner hearts, and the people around us. And those are called the yamas and niyamas, and they have to do with observing certain principles in ourselves and restraining from certain things that harm others. In addition to that, there's meditation. In addition to that, there's breath work. In addition to that, there are poses. And all of those together are yoga. And these sciences of how to take care of our body, our mind, and our spirit and yoke them together, which is the science of yoga, is actually one of the treatment methods of Ayurveda. So yoga has contributed to Ayurveda. I give a trick question to my medical students. I say, what is the science of keeping the heart healthy? What is the science of heart prevention, heart disease prevention called? And some students will say, well, what do you guys think? Some people will say cardiology, that's the name of the science. I'll say, no, cardiology is really about when the heart gets sick. Yeah, it's a study of heart sickness, though. If you look at cardiology, they don't study the heart and how it's well, they study the heart and how it's sick. Interventional cardiology is how to intervene on the heart. Cardiovascular surgery. What's the science of keeping the heart healthy? It's yoga. It's yoga. Yoga actually has a science that talks about heart rate, heart physiology, how the breath affects the heart, how the lungs are in relationship to the heart, and that's why the lung and the breath work is important, how to eat around the time of the heart. And we're going to talk about some of that as our Ayurveda interventions. So that's one of the very strong philosophies. Another is a spiritual philosophy, which is a very deep philosophy called Sankhya, and it has to do with where we come from and how we perceive. And Ayurveda is taken from that we are not just mind, body, spirit. We are mind, body, spirit, and senses. And senses. The senses, the 5 senses that we have, if they are not clean, do not allow us to take information from our mind and give it to our body. So the classic example in Ayurveda is that a man is walking down a dark street and he sees something on the ground and he jumps and his heart is trembling, his hands are sweaty, he runs and he's very, very scared because he thinks it's a snake. The next morning he travels back on that road and he sees that same thing on the ground and realizes it's a stick that was laying there. So what kept him from perceiving that that was a stick and thinking it was a snake and then responding improperly or unneededly to it? It's because his senses were not clear, because he couldn't see in the dark, right? In the night, in the dark. And the shadows made a different picture for him, bless you. So that ability to sense things properly isn't just in the dark. It happens every day. We misperceive our husbands and our wives, our kids, we misperceive our colleagues, we misperceive our parents, we misperceive people that are around us, we misperceive their intentions sometimes. That's where the source of conflict is. We misperceive, and when I say perceive, I mean the ears hearing things, I didn't hear you correctly, or you didn't say that, that's not what I heard. Who's right, who's wrong? Seeing things, smelling things, tasting, and of course touching. For humans, mostly it's about seeing and hearing. So Ayurveda says that if you can keep your senses clean, you will actually create a better relationship between your mind and its thoughts and your body, and the neurotransmitters that your mind puts out in relation to those emotions. Like the guy in the dark road, he suddenly got scared, and what happened? He poured out adrenaline, which was his fight or flight hormone. He poured out cortisol, which is his stress hormone. He poured out all these chemicals. His insulin shut down, his let's say his muscles tightened up, his hairs were on end. All of these reactions happen on a physiology level because of his perception of that stick being a snake. So we do that in our lives. We perceive things, we become paranoid, and we have certain ideals. And then we translate all that and we create disease in our body, because when those hormones keep putting themselves out in imbalanced ways, that creates chronic disease. Some people call that psychosomatic, but indeed, Ayurveda says that most disease, 90% of diseases, start in the mind and the gut. And the gut is related to mind because our mind decides what we actually put into our mouth. Okay? So, spiritual philosophy is actually quite important. Spirituality does not mean God. It does not mean, going to church or going to synagogue. It means having a sense of self and relationship between the mind, the body, the spirit, and the senses. Nyaya is logic and inquiry about truth, and it has to do with the way in which we perceive what is real and what is knowledge and truth in our scientific evidence. And interestingly, Ayurveda actually came up with a very complex way of looking at what is actual scientific evidence. And I found this to be extremely fascinating, because most people say, well, the reason Ayurveda doesn't work, how do we know that it works? There's no scientific evidence for it. Have you ever heard that? There's no scientific evidence for Ayurveda. All the time. So I looked into this. I'm a scientist. People were making fun of me. Why are you going into that Ayurveda stuff? There's a guy named Jeffrey Sachs, who's an economist at Columbia. And maybe you could turn that down. He said, well, Bhaswati, it'd be fair. I asked him the question, you're interested in the Earth Institute and the things that the Earth does. What would it look like to talk with humans who've been studying the relationship of man with the environment for the last 5,000 years? Those people are called Ayurvedic physicians. What would it look like? He says, well, that would be all fine and good, but there's no evidence for Ayurveda. And I just said, Jeffrey, we need to have a talk. So that talk is still waiting to happen. But I went and looked into this, and what I found is that Nyaya talks about valid forms of knowledge. And what's fascinating to me is they decided very early on that cutting rats open, which is what modern medicine does, they do most of their experiments on rats and mice, and then inferring that what happened in the rat or the mouse is exactly what's going to be happening in the human. That's where clinical evidence, that's where scientific in vivo evidence comes from. That's where most of the basis of our drugs come from. In addition to that, they take humans and they'll put you in a clinical study, what we call a randomized, controlled, placebo-controlled, double-blinded trial. You don't get to know what you're taking. The doctor doesn't get to know what you're taking, and they call that truth. Okay, I call that blind. Ayurveda says we don't want you to be blind. We want you to be aware. Your senses need to be working. They will randomize you into different trials, and they will give you a placebo. You don't even know that you're taking the actual medicine. That's also known in Ayurveda as deception. So Ayurveda doesn't want to do placebo-controlled trials that are double-blinded. So what they said is, why don't we just watch people and see what happens? So for thousands of years, they watched people. And they have this principle called upashaya, where they will give you something and watch how you react to it. And if you react well to it, they'll say, okay, this worked. And if you didn't react well, then they'll say, okay, that didn't work. And when the next person has a similar symptom, they'll try it and say, oh, it didn't work on him either, or it did work on him. And from the pattern of seeing hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, they just started making notes that if someone is given hot water before their meal, it will help them to digest their food better. So now we can say a recommendation is to give people